Reena Bhatia, CEO and President of Proposal Helper and Bid Execs. Proposal Helper has been in business for over 13 years. We have helped our clients write over 3,000 winning proposals and win over $2.5 billion in federal, DoD, state, and commercial contracts. We have a full business development through Proposal Solutions Department, from identifying and qualifying leads, helping introduce you to teaming partners, talk to the government, and then build the winning proposals from compliant outlines specific to your RFP, whether you want to do it yourself or have our solutions experts and technical writers, pricing experts help you build winning proposals. We are a one-stop solutions company. Reach out today to Proposal Helper for all your BD and proposal solutions.
All right, it's exactly 11 o'clock Eastern. Let's get rolling with introductions here. And I'm excited to talk about an important bid that's coming up. And I have my trusted partner in crime, Sai Alba from Polaro Mazza, with us. And we're going to have some fun today. We're going to have lots of interactive discussion. I hope you guys have come to us with questions and looking forward to discussing all things about DHS PACTS III, the new IDIQ. It's not new, but the IDIQ that's going to be coming up here soon. So let's just go through some basics, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of why you all are here. But before I do that, let me please call on Sai to introduce himself and talk about himself and Polaro Mazza. Sai, over to you.
Thanks, Reena. Yeah, hey everybody. Thanks for coming. As Reena said, my name is Sai Alba. I'm the current chair of the Government Contracts Group here at Polaro Mazza. A lot of people on the call probably know who we are. We're a law firm specializes in government contracts and dealing with a lot of small and mid-sized firms in the space. So happy to be here and walk through all these fun and exciting issues and some potential problems. So thanks again.
Potential problems. Oops, that doesn't sound very good. We're not starting off on a good footing here. For participants, please use the chat box for networking with each other. Your questions should be submitted in the Q&A box. We're not going to be monitoring the chat channel for questions, so please be mindful of that. Quickly introduce myself. I'm Reena Bhatia. I'm the CEO of Proposal Helper and Bid Execs. We've been in business 13 years, providing business development and proposal services. And I'm looking forward to having this discussion. I'm sure everybody is still recovering from their OASIS submissions and Polaris resubmissions, but we don't have time to keep talking about those. We're going to move right into PACTS III. For those of you who might discover that PACTS III is not the best fit for you, I just want to give you a heads up. There's another multiple award IDIQ coming out of DHS, S&T, the CETA 4 support services. We anticipate the RFP to come out the second quarter of 2024. If you'd like to learn more about that, we have some folks in the chat channel who can help you set up an appointment to discuss a different IDIQ if or it may be in addition to PACTS III that you might want to look at this. All right, let's discuss PACTS III, Program Management, Administrative, Clerical, and Technical Services coming out of the Department of Homeland Security. I'll just give you a basic overview here so that we all know we're in the, as my professors always say, that you know you're in the correct classroom. If you find out this is not the class you signed up for, you can leave now. This is PACTS III coming out of Homeland Security, can be used agency-wide across DHS. There are 4 set-aside criterias and categories, socioeconomic groups that DHS is going to be using: the SDVOSB, WOSB, Hub Zone, and 8A. This departs from what DHS has done previously, which was set this aside only for SDVOSB. They have now opened it up to other socioeconomic categories. It is a multiple award IDIQ. There are 3 functional categories that have different NAICS codes for each one. So for size standard purposes, each functional category has a different size standard depending on the NAICS code assigned to it. At the IDIQ level, there's a different NAICS code, but you have to qualify as a small business for each functional category and its associated NAICS code. The period of performance for this is a total of 10 years, but there's a 3-year base, and then you recertify yourself 3 2-year options. So after the first 3-year base, every 2 years, there will be an option renewed, and then a one-year option at the end. So total period of performance is 10 years, but base is 3 years, and then there are option periods. The place of performance obviously will be determined at task order level. This is not a new vehicle. This has been around previously. This is the 3rd iteration of PACTS. There are multiple incumbents, and if anyone is interested in receiving a list of incumbents, feel free to reach out to us. They're also available online. The ceiling value for this opportunity is $5.6 billion. So no chump change here. For small business, this vehicle being a small business set aside, that is a beautiful number to see as long as the government spends it all on small business. All right, the major goals of this opportunity of PACTS III, very clearly the department is saying that they want a quick ordering process for professional services at fair and reasonable prices. I'm going to emphasize fair and reasonable prices. The second goal is to give qualified small businesses a greater opportunity to participate in these requirements. Remember, this was only set aside for SDVOSBs. Now they've opened it up to other small business categories. So the DHS really does want to give other businesses an opportunity to get in and earn some of the piece of this $5.6 billion pie. To assist the department in continuing to achieve and exceed its small business and socioeconomic goals. So this vehicle is going to be very important for DHS to meet its socioeconomic goals as well. Truly a lot of emphasis on small business. All right, the statement of work, we internally call it the trifecta, but I don't know if that actually makes any sense. There are 3 functional categories that are part of this statement of work. Each one is independent of the other. You do not have to bid on all 3. They're not connected. You can pick and choose which ones you want to bid on. The nature of work for each one is different. So please make sure that you understand and have the capabilities to bid on the functional category. But again, the good thing is each one is independent of the other. All right, historical and projected task orders. As far as the projected task orders that the government has mentioned in their second draft, they have increased the number of task orders they anticipate coming out in each of these 3 functional categories. Historically, what we have found is PACTS II has awarded about 112 task orders to approximately 35 companies. So you can see the huge increase in the activity that DHS anticipates coming through this vehicle. All right, number of awards planned. If you read how they plan to award this, they plan to make approximately 5 awards for each of the 4 socioeconomic tracks. So a total of 60 awards, 20 in each functional category. So that may not seem like a huge number of awards, but they also say that they might award more or fewer. But right now they're anticipating awarding about 60 selecting 60 awardees. This is a new term that the government seems to have coined for itself to be considered as a highest technically rated offerer with fair and reasonable price. So they don't want to call it low LPTA. They're not going to call it best value. They've coined the term HTRO FRP, highest technically rated offer at fair and reasonable price will be selected on this for this vehicle. All right, before we take up all of Sai's time asking, can I use my subcontractors' projects for this? No, you may not, but Sai will clarify all of that. I do want to point out that the way the draft is written right now, there are only two types of teaming arrangements acceptable on PACTS III, a joint venture teaming arrangement or an SBA mentor-protege arrangement, and Sai will touch a little bit more on these terms that the government has used very confusingly. But I just want to point out that if you are planning on asking a question of, can I use my subcontractor's past performance in a pure prime sub relationship, PACTS III currently does not allow that. All right, now that I've stirred up the pot, Sai, and created all the trouble that I could, I'm turning it over to you to go ahead and talk about all the fun stuff that PACTS III brings to us.
Yeah, thanks, Rena. Yeah, I see there's already some questions about some of this stuff with using subcontractors and whatnot. It's confusing because, and Rena and I were talking about this a little while ago, it's very confusing because you have to look at multiple different places to come to that conclusion. So if you were to look at the Q&A and that says one thing, which we'll get into in a little while, and then if you look at the general sections of the RFP that talk about who can form teams together, how you can form teams, the definition that's on the screen right now, the definition of an offeror, because the offeror, right, says prime contractor without subcontractors or affiliates, and all members of an SBA joint venture, SBA mentor protege program, or small business teaming arrangement. So you could read that sentence and say, oh, well, everybody's the offeror, which is what the FAR generally allows, and in some cases what SBA requires, and we'll get into that too. But when you start to parse the other sections of the RFP, in particular, what is relevant experience as defined, you'll notice that they then remove subcontractors or affiliates from the definition of an offeror as far as past performance and experience and capabilities. And they also remove subcontractors from the definition of a small business teaming arrangement, even though the FAR site they use for what that is a prime sub relationship. So they're saying you can have a prime sub relationship, you can bid this work using that kind of relationship, but you're not going to be able to rely upon your subcontractors' experience and past performance. Even if, and this is important, even if they are also a small business or even a similarly situated small business. And the distinction there is, let's say you're going after the 8A track. You can have a small business subcontractor that is small under the NAICS code, just like you. That entity, though, is not technically similarly situated unless they are also an 8A company. So, and for woman-owned, same thing. They have to be small and woman-owned. Even in that circumstance, the RFP is not allowing the use of their past performance and experience. And I find that interesting because, as we'll get into a little bit later, I think it's a violation of the SBA rules. So I'm curious if they get enough blowback from that it will be changed later, or if they're going to let it ride and see if people file pre-award or really pre-bid protests, which is another note before we jump to the next slide. If there is an issue that persists in the RFP, or if the government continues to answer questions in this vague and amorphous manner, if there is some discrepancy in the RFP that is obvious on the face of the RFP, and then you wait until you lose the procurement, and then you say, well, look, this was clearly confusing. The Q&A said one thing, this section said another thing, a different section said a different thing. It didn't make any sense. We even asked a question about it. The government didn't answer it. If you then wait till you lose to raise those questions or raise those issues or file a protest, it will be untimely. So you need to recognize that pushing the agency now before the solicitation is even out is great, once it comes out, pushing in any Q&A to directly force them to change this or answer the questions is also great. But if that bid date starts approaching and some of these issues that are clearly problematic or are what I call patently, obviously confusing, that needs to be protested before. And if nobody protests it and everybody bids, you cannot raise it later when you lose. You can only raise things that were not patent ambiguities or patent discrepancies or issues with the RFP at the time that you bid. You just lose that right. So just be aware of that. And it doesn't mean you have to go to the court or GAO. You can go to the agency, but you have to file something in order to preserve your rights. And if you lose, you have to then file something else too. So just be aware of that. The only reason why this last piece is in here, this last section that talks about how you can't submit multiple proposals for a specific task order, is I've seen that come up because that language has confused some people, because you are allowed to submit multiple proposals for this PACTS III or IDIQ generally. It's just when you get to the task orders, specific orders, you're not going to be able to in the same way you're allowed at the IDIQ level. So that's just there to not get confused. You can submit multiple proposals with some restrictions that we'll talk about. If you're a JV and you want to go as a prime, or you're on a different team as a sub, that's fine. You can be on all of those all at the same time. You just can't use experience multiple times, which we'll talk about. All right, I think we're good to go to the next section. This I like to talk about because with what I do on the legal side, we don't really help with proposals, but when we get to the question of, hey, what happens if I grow large? I'm gonna exceed my size standard, and in that first 3-year period, when that ends, I'm gonna recertify, and I'm gonna have to recertify, or I guess with the 5-year mark, I'm gonna recertify, and I'm not gonna be small anymore. What does that mean for me? How is that gonna work? Should I put in the bid now? Should I go on someone else's team? And this clearly says that if you can't recertify, then they're going to off-ramp you off the project. So just make sure that you realize that and you're putting in the appropriate level of effort if you're going to be off-ramped. Similarly, if you're in a joint venture, and I know a lot of people are forming major JVs because of that issue we talked about, where you can't use subcontractor affiliate experience. If you're in a JV with 20 people, 10 people, whatever, realize that when you get to that 5-year recertification mark, or if there's some other request for recertification throughout the process, every single one of those companies has to be a small business, or your JV is not small. So if somebody has some little piece of your JV, the second they become a large business and there's any sort of request for recertification for a task order or something like that, you won't be eligible for that task order. If one of them becomes a large business and you hit that 5-year mark where you're required to recertify under 13 CFR 121-404G, once you hit that mark, you will be off-ramped, at least if they stick strictly to what they're proposing here. So I just throw that out there so everyone is aware of that fact, and they're moving forward. Another interesting part here for the non-mandatory off-ramping is not adhering to the limitation on subcontracting rules. And so those rules can be confusing when you're dealing with joint ventures, especially if you're in a JV that's 8A, has 10 members, 2 of them are 8A, 8 of them aren't, all that kind of stuff. That's all well and good. You can do that if it's set up appropriately, but then those 2 8A companies are going to have to do 40% of the work JV is doing. The other 8 companies can do 60. If you're subcontracting up to 49%, then that 49% isn't counted in the 40/60. So you have to make sure with whatever you're doing in the JV, you're splitting it appropriately. So it gets pretty complicated when you're dealing with the limitation on subcontracting rules. In addition to that, I've seen a lot of procurements, and it's not entirely clear here how they're going to handle this, but where they start asking for reporting every year. And this is non-mandatory off-ramping, but let's say you report 2 years in a row that you're not in compliance. Well, under SBA's rules, you don't measure it every year. You measure it period by period under the contract. And as Rena was pointing out earlier, here we've got 3-year period, 2-year period, 2-year period, 1-year period. So when you're looking at that setup like that, you need to be compliant during each of those periods, not each year. That's what SBA's rules require. There's been a lot of procurements where the agencies start wanting information or treating people like they're not compliant if they're out of compliance in just 1 year, even though the period on that particular contract is more than a year. Similarly, I know it's not the case here, but if you had a situation where you had a 6-month period, you have to be compliant in that 6-month period in a vacuum, and then it resets. So every period it resets. And in theory, though, if you're not meeting the requirements, I've never seen the agency do it in just one instance, but if they start giving you a hard time in year 2, you can push back on them and say, wait a minute, guys, you said not adhering to 52.219.14. However, the SBA's rules have been amended to clearly state that we don't have to be in compliance every year. We have to be in compliance over the base period, at least initially, and then each subsequent period, which is more than a year until you get to the very end. So we can make that up. If we fail in year 1, we fail in year 2, we make it up in year 3, we're fine. Under the SBA rules, that is perfectly fine because the entire period of that base is 3 years. Also, when people are on ramping, you're going to have to recertify or certify your size status. So just be aware of that as well. And again, in your JVs, if you're putting together JVs for that, or you're going after different tracks with a different JV, and the more members you have, the more confusing it's going to get to make sure that you're complying with everything. Let's see. I think those are the main pieces here. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, so I raised this too because this comes up a lot also when people, even at the beginning, which sounds crazy, but even at the beginning, people are thinking, okay, well, if I win a contract, maybe someone will just buy it from me. I want to retire soon, or I think it'd be more valuable if I just get rid of it. I don't want to actually perform. That's been a major problem. I mean, I heard of people who put themselves on the auction block when the pre-award notices, not even the actual award, came out for CISP4. There are companies that said, all right, I'm on this list, which now, by the way, that, as you might know, that list is now in the trash can because they're reevaluating. But people got on that list and said, okay, who wants to buy it? Or who wants to buy this from me? There are issues with that because if there's no work on the vehicle, there could be Anti-Assignment Act problems, and a lot more contracting officers now are being sticklers about that. So I just say this is the current iteration says that there's no major issues or no specific issues. Like doesn't say if you do it, we're going to deny it, or everyone has to be better than the top awardees or anything like that. It's much more permissive. But if you're thinking about trying to get out early or moving the contract around to different entities after award, it can still be a problem because contracting officers don't really like that. And if you're doing it to someone who can't recertify as small or whatever your representation is, 8A woman-owned, it's also going to be a problem. So I just note that up front before people start putting teams and thinking about different monetization strategies down the line. All right, next. There are no restrictions on the number of projects you can put together, which I think is why we've started to see these massive teams come together of joint venture, in a joint venture specifically, where they're saying, great, we're going to push all this past performance, all this experience, because we're in a JV with 15 people, and we're all going to use all of our experience and get a lot of points for all of this that we're doing, and we're going to be one of the more highly rated offer orders in that case. But as I noted, that comes with some risks as well. If someone becomes large or there's some other issue like that, tracking the a limitation on subcontracting, all of those things can be a little bit confusing. And they're sort of creating this problem by saying you can't use affiliates, you can't use subcontractors. I think we're going to see more of these JVs that are oversized joint ventures where everybody's just throwing themselves into the lot. The other thing I'll note with that too is if you are in a mentor-protege relationship and you're bringing your mentor into your joint venture, you cannot just throw a bunch of other small businesses into that JV. Because if you did that, those other small businesses don't have the protection from affiliation vis-a-vis your mentor. And assuming your mentor is a large business, adding another member to that JV who's not their protege would blow the size status of that joint venture. So be careful with that too, because I've seen that floated and people have talked about that a lot, about how to maximize these things. Another thing I've heard is, and there is no case law on this at all, so very risky proposition, is this idea of nesting joint ventures. So having a joint venture made up of joint ventures, that's creative. I've certainly batted it around and walked through all the various rules, like the performance of work and how it will be calculated. Just note that there is no law or regulation that contemplates that. So if you're going in that direction, there's no case that has said you can't, but there's no case that says you can. And the rules are clearly not structured to contemplate that kind of arrangement. So that is just a risky proposition. I believe certain people did it in other procurements. And again, it's just never been challenged, never been tested. So just be aware of that risk. Okay, let's go to the next.
And before we go to the next slide, I really want to, this baffles me where it says there's no limitation on the number of qualifying projects. I mean, at what point do you say, okay, I've got maximum points? And I think somebody pointed this out in the Q&A. At this point in the draft, they have not given us a passing threshold. They have not determined that number yet. So at some point, it's just going to get out of hand if companies continue to form JVs like we are seeing, as you mentioned, and we are also seeing companies just pile on top of each other in a JV to get the maximum number of experiences. Very strange.
Yeah, and I've even had people talk about how they got burned with COSP4 because they misread certain parts because the timing of what you could take credit for and obligated funding and all that got confusing. And so some folks have said, well, if I'm confused by the language, instead of attempting to protest or seek clarification over and over that the agency never gives me, I'm just going to take every possible thing and throw it in there. And if some of them get knocked out, it doesn't matter. I've got enough in the pot. It's just like filling it up as much as you can, which seems like an administrative nightmare for the agency. But I guess that's the way it is.
Because they do say if they're not going to disqualify the whole proposal, they disqualify the project that you claim, and readjust your points. So yeah, that's why people just they're like, I'll throw everything in there and see if they disqualify a few points, I still have enough.
Yeah, and we might talk about that right now. I don't think I noted what you're referring to is this idea that you can't use past performance references across multiple proposals. And that's something I think is going to be very difficult to manage from the contractor side. Because if you're not teaming, let's say you worked with someone on a project and you're not talking with them anymore, you might hate each other. Something might have happened and the two companies don't even talk to each other anymore. In that context, they might be using the project and you might be using the project, and it might be a major project. Or you talk to them and say, hey, just to let you know, I'm bidding on PACTS, I'm going to use this project. And they say, oh, wait a minute, I'm bidding on PACTS, I'm going to use the project. Don't use that project. And then what are you going to do? You're going to start fighting about who's using it? Or you're both going to use it and it's just going to get thrown out. It's I don't know if people are aware of the thing called the prisoner's dilemma in philosophy. My degree's in philosophy, so and where you sit there and it's beneficial if both people agree to do something, or people agree with each other, like you'll use this one, I'll use that one. However, human beings don't really operate like that. Everyone's trying to win all the time and take from everybody. And so there's this dilemma where if a prisoner flips on someone, maybe they'll get a better deal. But if they stay together and nobody flips, they'll both get a little worse than if the other person flips, but as a unit, they'll do better. That's kind of what I feel like is going on here with all of this, because you're going to have to start coordinating with who knows how many people, right? There could be a bunch of people you've worked with on a bunch of things over the past couple of years, and everyone's going to start using experience and past performance. And before you know it, everybody's using things that someone else is using, and 90% of your references are being thrown out. And you might not even know. So it's a little messy.
Yeah. So speaking of that, where you've fallen out with your previous JV, the JV no longer exists, but the projects are relevant. We had that scenario with one of our clients, and we actually were intermediaries because neither one wanted to talk to the other. So we were in the middle going, hey, can you be nice? Can you please let them use this? And the other one was like, no, you go tell them that. And I was like, why are we doing this? But they didn't want to talk to each other. And we ended up having to be the intermediaries. It can get pretty ugly. But yes, it's difficult. Now on some of the other projects where you could not use the same project on more than one proposal, we made sure our prime got a written confirmation from all their teaming partners saying that we confirm that we are not providing this project to any other proposal, that we're only using it in yours, and had their team sign off, even though it wasn't required by the RFP or anywhere to be uploaded. We just wanted to make sure we made it abundantly clear to our teaming partners that you understand that you cannot go around giving this project to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow, but go for it.
No, this is all good stuff. And that the other interesting thing when you're talking about experience past performance is this idea of the mentor protege stuff, which I think is on this slide. When you're dealing with a mentor protege, the way the RFP has it set up is they're treating it like it's analogous to being a prime, being in a joint venture, having a small business teaming arrangement, which is prime sub, and having a mentor protege. Like those things are all the same, and they're not. A mentor protege arrangement can, in some cases, rare as it might be, have nothing to do with bidding on a contract or doing work together. You can have, in fact, SBA would probably love that. They would love if your mentor was focused on helping you grow as a business and having nothing to do with doing work with you. That's their dream of what the mentor protege is, having a mentor do things out of the kindness of their hearts. And so when in the RFP, they're talking about, you can be a JV, you can be a small business teaming arranger, you can be a prime, or you can be mentor protege. I don't know what they're getting at. A mentor protege joint venture? Because that's just a joint venture with a mentor. So it's not its own thing. Sure, there are certain rules that apply and when it could qualify as small and all that. But really, there is no mentor protege unit that you bid with yourself, unless what they're trying to get at, and I think this might be the case, is that if you're in a mentor protege, they're not restricting the structure. So unlike a bunch of small businesses that can't prime sub, they all have to form this massive JV and have all those headaches we talked about. If you're in a mentor protege relationship that's approved by SBA, you can do it as a JV or you can do it as prime sub. And in either way, you could use the mentor's experience and past performance up to 60%, so long as you're doing up to 40%. That's the way I'm looking at it right now. It's not entirely clear. I'd like, hopefully in the final RFP, maybe they'll drill down on that or get rid of this whole concept of not using subcontractors entirely, because as it says on here, that restriction saying if you're a small business prime, you can't rely on small business subcontracts is a direct violation of 13 CFR 125.2G. And so assuming that the small business prime cannot stand on its own, the law requires that agencies consider the experience and past performance of small business subcontractors And so I'm curious how that's going to work out as well. This whole issue of recency is also something I've seen come up a lot, and it was huge with COSP4. There were so many questions in that one. And so I want to be clear here that as long as it's currently written, the past performance you're using has to be a contract performed within the last 2 years of the original RFP date. So as of now, there is no date. We don't know what that date is. I've had people ask me that too. I have no idea. Once the original RFP is released, the real one, that date is going to be locked in stone. You go backwards 2 years, your contracts had to have been performed during that period to count. And also, they couldn't have been performed for less than 6 months. So if you're waiting on some big award, you're like, that's going to be amazing, I'm going to use that past performance reference, and it comes down in February, and then the RFP for this drops in March or April or May or whatever, the original RFP drops, you're still going to be less than 6 months, so you cannot use that experience. It will not count. And so there's no way to know what that date is. There's no way to plan ahead. It's kind of just luck of the draw. If your work gets awarded soon enough that you can have performance, and at the same time, if you have big contracts that are coming up on that 2-year mark and you're no longer performing, every month that RFP creeps out, it might fall off. So you're going to have to be nimble in thinking about, well, what past performance am I still going to have? It depends on when the RFP comes out. If it comes out on this month, then we'll use these. If it comes out that month, I'll use these. So just be aware of that as well. It could get kind of confusing.
I apologize. I lost power here suddenly, but I'm back, and I'll bring the slides back up in just a second.
Okay.
Don't know how.
Yeah, and I was just going to go, I'll just keep, so the next slide, which I think Rena can throw up there, is about facility clearances and certain evaluation criteria. So first of all, we wanted to note that you don't need a facility clearance to bid on this work. It'll get you points, but it's not a requirement. It also, though, then goes on to say you need an active facility clearance. So you can't just have something in the process and get points for it. You have to actually have it. And for joint ventures, I find it interesting because unlike the subcontractor rules that violate the SBA rule because it's too restrictive, what they're proposing here for small business joint ventures to get credit, it says it can be members of the JV, the protege or non-qualifying member. It doesn't matter. If anyone has it, they're allowing things. And I read that as actually being over-inclusive, like beyond what the SBA rules say you have to do, which is great for people. It allows you more opportunities to get credit, but it's not really what the SBA rules say. And I find it interesting because if you're getting points for this because of, say, your mentor's FCL, and then you go to bid on a task order, if the agency soliciting or the entity within DHS soliciting the task order is following the rules at that time, they're going to say this requires a facility clearance. If the primary and vital requirements of that contract require a clearance to be performed, your JV, even though you're checked off in the system for PACTS III as having a facility clearance because you're a mentor, your JV still will not be eligible to win that task order, because if the protege doesn't have it and the primary and vital requirements of the contract require it, SBA rules say that JV is not eligible. So again, this is more not for this proposal. If you're like, I just need points, you're throwing everybody in there. That's one way to do it. But realize that if you're doing that and you're just throwing someone in for an FCL or your mentor has it and you're not going to worry about getting one as the protege, that could bite you later when the task orders actually come out. So just something to be aware of. All right, should we go on to the next thing? I think we already talked about a lot of this. There's no limitation on projects. You will be limited when it comes to using projects in multiple proposals. They're not allowing you to do that. So just that sort of trickiness in navigating those waters. All right, yeah, I think that kind of that slide is fine. For this one, this is where I also found it somewhat strange. It goes back to what we were talking about before, where they're saying that offers from SBA joint ventures, SBA mentor protege, and small business teaming arrangements are encouraged. Yet at the same time, if you're in a small business teaming arrangement, they're cutting you off at the knees by saying all the experience of all your team members isn't relevant. And they're again using this term SBA mentor protege like it's a structure that you bid with, and it's simply not. So I'm not entirely sure what they're really getting at. I think they might not have completely understood the implications of what they were saying, and so I'm hopeful that maybe some of this gets changed, but we'll have to see. So next up is also kind of interesting, because when they're talking about companies submitting as a prime and joint venture, like multiple proposals for the same categories. And they're saying, yeah, this is fine. However, at the same time, they're saying you can't reuse experience. So I could see situations, and if you're going to be in a joint venture with folks, this might be something to talk to the whole team about. I could see individuals saying, okay, well, I'm going to be in this joint venture to give myself a second bite at the apple. But all my really good experience in past performance, I'm putting over here in my prime bid, because I really think I've got a shot at being a prime contractor here, not part of a JV. And I've got enough, depending on what these cutoffs end up being later when we know what they are. If you think you have enough to win yourself and keep everything for yourself, then I could see people using their best things for themselves, not for the joint venture, which then could limit the effectiveness of the joint venture. Or you've got members that you're throwing in that maybe don't understand what we're talking about. They didn't read the RFP clearly or something, and they're going to use it on their own proposal without telling you, and you're using it on your JV proposal, and now everybody uses it. So again, coming down to having these discussions with everyone and really trying to think through and strategize about what you're going to do. And I think in a lot of cases, it might not make sense to have these multiple proposals going in, because you're going to have to pick and choose who's going to win, who's going to lose, based on the restriction of the experience and past performance and all of that. So we'll have to see what happens. Another thing I saw in the Q&A here when it comes to JVs is there was a question that I think this one, 98, I think what the person asking the question was getting at is, can I form a JV that has an 8A member in it and a WSB member? The WSB is not 8A, the 8A is not WSB. Can I put them together in a joint venture and go bid both socioeconomic categories? And the answer they gave is a non-answer, in my opinion, where they just said, look, go look at the RFP and, you got to figure it out. But if you just look at the RFP, you're not going to answer your question, because the real answer is no, you cannot do that. And you can never do that, because your JV is going to be certifying to eligibility as whatever small business category you're submitting on. And if you formed a JV in that example I gave to fit the 8A rules, it would automatically violate the WSB rules. And if you structured the JV to fit the WSB rules, it would automatically violate the 8A rules. You can't have both. You could set up two joint ventures, and the 8A could have 51% of one, and you meet all the 8A rules in that one. And then you have another JV that's WSB, and you put all the WSB rules in that one. And so you sort of flip the 51%, and then you all go bid. However, if you do that, you're going to have the problem of who gets the better past performance and experience, or how you're going to go that direction. The only way you can do this and meet the RFP requirements and SBA's rules is if you find someone to be the 51% owner, or in theory, if you can find multiple people who meet the qualifications of all the programs you're going after. If you find someone that's an 8A woman-owned service-able vet company, great. Throw them in as 51%. If you find 5 of them, they can share the 55%, of 51% of the JV, and you'll still be qualified so long as you structure the agreement and meet all the other rules, right? So that can work, but you got to find those sort of unicorn or whatever you want to call it types of companies that hit everything. You can't throw a bunch of people that have disparate eligibility and suddenly make that JV qualify for everything. That's not the way it works. And I think that's what the question they were asking, and the agency just didn't answer it appropriately. All right, I guess go to the next thing about the draft RFP and dealing with things in a joint venture, teaming arrangement, or mentor protege. The real question is, can a joint venture have teaming arrangements with other small businesses and submit qualifying experience and past performance? They essentially said no, right? They said the JV is its own entity, and just like with a small business prime who can't use their small business subs, your small business JV can't use the small business subs. And just like I said before, that I believe is a violation of 13 CFR 125.2G. So this is another example of where the RFP, I think, violated the rules there, and arguably should be cleaned up. And I think that kind of wraps up the key things we were going to talk about. We have like the key takeaway slide, and then we can get to some of the questions.
Yeah, I moved to the key takeaways. Are we on that slide? Are you seeing it? Okay.
Yeah, I see it now. So I think these are just the main things we walked through, right? You can use a bunch of past performance, there's no limit, but you have that risk issue where people are using multiple ones and you lose points. I think some of the subcontractor experience rules violate the SBA rules, and that applies to JVs and subcontractors. The failure to allow affiliate past performance, I think it's not a clear violation of the SBA rules. It's not a violation of the FAR. However, I think there's a question in my mind about whether that's unduly restrictive of competition, because especially if you're structuring your business as a small business to try to take advantage of potentially in the future hiving off revenue and trying to maintain your small business status, you might have structured yourself in a way where you have affiliates, you have subsidiaries, and the FAR allows that entire family of companies to be treated as one thing. And here they're saying no. And I don't necessarily see a basis for that. So I think there's protest risk there as well. The performance window, make sure you understand it, make sure you follow it. That 2-year rule and the 6-month rule we talked about, I think is also very important given what I've seen in the past. And then this idea of multiple proposals, again, just make sure you're being careful as you're doing that. Those are the main things that I saw that I feel like I'm going to get questions about, or people are going to be about.
So, Sai, before we move into Q&A session, on the period of the performance period of the projects, in this one it is minimum 6 months within the 2-year window. Isn't that also in violation of SBA, where SBA says you can use projects going back to 5 years, or did I get that wrong?
Yeah, I do think there's an issue with that as well. It's just the rule is not as clear as to what it means. I don't believe there's been any cases on this about consideration of experience and when can you consider something and still disregard it, I think is a question. But to your point, I think there is some risk there that the agency is being overly restrictive or unduly restrictive.
So let's just hope that this thing doesn't get mired into protests or pre-RFP protests like we have seen on others. But if that means that's the only way the agency will answer questions and fix this RFP, unfortunately, we may have to go down that path. All right, we're going to go get into the Q&A session here. I just want to have Sai's information up here. My information is up here. If you'd like to continue the conversation or have any questions, do send those to us. We will be happy to try and answer as best as we can. But, definitely I was excited to see the very small business friendly IDIQ, and I was thrilled to see it. But then when I started getting into the meat and potatoes of it, I'm going, oh my God, they made this thing so complicated for absolutely no good reason. So we actually are advising companies, start on your own first, just baseline yourself. Where are you and what projects can you and can you not use? We don't have a threshold right now. So there's not a determination of, do I qualify? Because we don't know what qualification means at the moment, but at least start collecting your projects and seeing which ones can you even use on this bid, so that you're not scrambling once the final comes out. You have time, let's work on it. All right, so let's get into the Q&As, and Sai, you have access to them as well, but I'll start by asking some of the easy ones. There's a question here that says, what options are there if you don't qualify in any of the set aside categories? How do you take advantage and bid on this RFP then? Any thoughts on that? If you are not one of the 4 set aside categories.
Yeah, I mean, if you could still be a member of a joint venture, and let's say you just found an 8A company, right? And you're small, they're small. You form a JV, qualifies as 8A, you bid, you win the work. In theory, you could have that structured. If you have no subcontractors working on any of your task orders, the 8A has to do 40%. You, as a vanilla small business, can do 60% of that work. And even if you're not Mentor Protege or whatever, you're just small and you're qualified. So you can still get in as a member of the JV and do a significant portion of the work, even more than the 8A, technically. I think you get into that question of, are you going to get enough points? Because if you start piling more and more people into your JV, then it's going to restrict that 60% could get pretty small. And if you only have one 8A and 10 other non-8As to get that 8A requirement set, that 8A is going to do 40%, and the rest of you are going to have to split the 60. So you're only going to get, you average it out 6%. So be aware of that.
I think this is an important and interesting question that needs to be answered as well. In the projects that the prime is using, the prime is bidding. There's one company that's going to be the prime, but not all their projects are prime work. They didn't perform as a prime on all the projects that they're using to claim points. Are subcontracting experiences acceptable? I think that's a very good question. And I have my theory, but I'll let you come back to it.
Yeah, I think so. And what's also interesting is they cited to the FAR provision that allows for that, or not even the FAR, it was a 13 CFR, it was 125.3. They cited to the SBA rule, which, by the way, if they would have just hit previous in the ECFR, they would have, and scrolled to the bottom, they would have seen that the rule right before that they're violating. But they took that one rule and they did say, look, if you meet those requirements, you can use the subcontractor experience. There's some limitations on it. I can't have it so I can pull it up, but there were some specific limitations on, like, well, you have to know like what work you actually did, and then you have to get the correct form from the prime contractor that verifies that you did that particular scope of work. So it's not like I was a sub on this massive contract and I did some portion of it, and I can use all this stuff. They're going to want to see that you're taking credit for the work you actually did.
Yeah, that's the important part, that you don't take credit for the whole cell, and your prime does have to sign off on the project verification form. Absolutely. There's another question here. Is the 40-60% split of claimed projects by number of projects or by revenue? I think they're talking about the mentor protege. Yeah.
Yeah, that don't think was very clear. So that's a particular item that I think that they would need to clarify a little bit closer, because I had the same question whenever I looked at it, because I felt like I could read it different ways.
Yeah, I read it as number of experiences, not revenue, but that's a good, very good question. And I think, I don't know if in the Q&As anyone has asked that, but certainly worth submitting to the agency. I read it as number of projects. So if you submit 100 projects, 60% of those can come from the mentor and 40% has to come from the protege. I read it as number of projects.
That was my initial view as well. I'm just not entirely sure that that's what they meant, or because if things are smaller and the point structure, but that is the way I read it as well, as I said, first blush.
Yeah, and an important thing, I'm sure everybody has seen the scorecards. The highest dollar value projects don't necessarily get the highest points. So please be mindful of that as you guys are going out there thinking about all kinds of teaming arrangements and forming JVs or what have you. Not, just because a company has large projects does not necessarily benefit you. In fact, I think it is 1 to 5 million that has the most, or yeah, one of the very, between 1 and 10 million has the more favorable points. So you may want to keep that in mind. Now, I think you answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Will PACTS III allow for MRCLs, meaningful relationships, so that we can leverage the past performance of an affiliate that has exceeded the size standard of that functional category? If there's a meaningful relationship between the two entities, can you leverage the past performance, even though that meaningful relationship or that affiliate of yours does not qualify as a small business under that NAICS code?
Yeah, the way I read this particular, which section is this? 43111, the relevancy standard, that's really 4.3.1.1.1. That is, I think, one of the most important sections in here, because if it's determined to not be relevant under those rules that are outlined there, it gets thrown out. And if you look at H, it says the project is not from a subcontractor or affiliate of the prime contractor. So meaningful relationship or not, the way I read that, if it's an affiliate contract, it's not relevant. So it's out.
Okay, and another question on cross-teaming, just to be very clear on cross-teaming. Cross-teaming at the IDIQ level is not prohibited, but it is prohibited at the task order level. Is that correct?
Right, that's the way I read it.
But if you do cross-team at IDIQ, you still cannot have the same project show up in 2 different proposals, as Sai has pointed out multiple times. So just because you're on multiple teams doesn't mean you can take your same 10 past performances and dole it out to the same or multiple teaming partners. Questions here on threshold for scorecards. Yeah, the government has not released that yet. If you look at the draft RFP2, they have a table in there. It appears that they plan to release thresholds, but they have not released any thresholds yet. So that's TBD, to be determined. We'll see what they say. That's what I was saying earlier. It just baffles me if you don't put a finite number of projects, which somebody did ask that question or recommended that the government do that, or provide a threshold where the team can say, okay, we've met our threshold. We no longer need to add any more projects. The government will probably end up having to read hundreds of projects. I don't know how long it'll take to evaluate it.
Right.
Okay, can you use an unpopulated SDVOSB JV?
Can you use I mean, you have to. I guess it's the
All JVs are unpopulated, but
yeah, for SBA rules. Now, they did clarify in the latest change from a couple months ago, so this is pretty new, that you can have a populated joint venture and still have it qualify as a small business and not everybody be affiliated with each other, so long as every single member is similarly situated. So to have a populated SDVOSB JV where the members are not deemed affiliates with each other for purposes of that bid, every member of that JV has to be an SDVOSB small under the NAICS code.
Okay. And again, there's a question here from Chris. Let's not get confused over using past performance that you did as a subcontractor versus using subcontractor past performance. I think people got all tangled up over that. So you want to clarify that, Sai, a little bit?
Yeah, right. So it's pretty clear as well from that thing I read earlier that you look at 4.3.1.1.1H that the experience that you're using cannot be from a subcontractor. That is prohibited. It will not be relevant. However, if you are a prime and you're using experience that you gained when you were a subcontractor, you can use that, but you're going to have to meet the requirements of getting the verification form from your prime and all that kind of stuff. So two different things. Work you are providing as a proposed prime for PACTS III, if it was your own work that you did as you were a sub for someone else, that's okay. However, if you are a prime for PACTS III and you have a subcontractor, a proposed subcontractor for PACTS III, their experience in past performance cannot be used because it's not relevant.
Regardless of whether that subcontractor was prime sub, irrelevant, you cannot use subcontractor past performance on PACTS III. Yeah.
Right. Your proposed subcontractor's experience is not allowed. Your experience as a subcontractor somewhere else is allowed. I guess, is that clear? trying to figure out.
Or maybe we just got them even more confused. No, I think it's clear. There's a question here. Do we submit multiple scorecards under functional category 1 if we're going after multiple set-asides? No, yours, I'll take this, and if you want to back me up here, Sai, you submit one scorecard per functional category, and then you tell the government what set-asides you want to be considered for, but the same scorecard is for each functional category has one scorecard. So if you look at the draft, the government has released 3 scorecards, one for each functional category. Your set-asides don't make a difference. You just tell the government, I would like to be considered for these set-asides, but that same scorecard applies to all set-asides. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah. Okay, there are questions here that I cannot and neither can Sai answer. For example, when can we expect another industry day? That's up to the government. We don't know when they will have another industry day unless somebody has heard of a date and would like to share, but I don't know of another industry day that has been announced just yet.
Actually, I think we can answer that. It's potentially in the future, which is not helpful.
But spoken like a true lawyer. Question on, does the past performance have to be in the government sector or can it come from the commercial arena?
Yeah, it can be both. You just have to make sure you're following their specific rules in that same section. That's why that one section is like the Bible, right? Like pull that section out and that's what you follow. Where if you look at it and it says what you have to do, it's not dissimilar than what we talked about where you're using your own experience as a sub. You just have to get that form.
Right. Okay, how are they determining fair and reasonable price? No guidance at the moment. They have not released anything on that unless you have something.
I mean, the general rule for that is it's highly discretionary in the eyes of the contracting officer. Usually there's some amount there's a lot of flexibility. Sometimes they do variations from the mean. So if everybody puts in a proposal, they'll say anything more than 2 standard deviations from the mean in our evaluation sample will be deemed unreasonable. Something like that. And those sorts of things have been supported by the courts, so long as they don't introduce things like what they call false precision, which is like a math statistics term. But they can almost do anything they want, so long as it's a reasonable determination, and that would be something that a court would determine later. which is not a helpful answer, I guess, but that's the answer.
And I'm gonna wrap it up here because we have crossed the hour mark, and I appreciate your time, but there's a question that I thought was interesting. What does DHS expect to get out of PACTS III that it would not get from individual contracts?
Bonus points for using a vehicle. The
Category
contract
management.
yeah, they're going to get a pat on the back for the individuals.
Yeah, so
yeah,
if you guys are not familiar with category management, definitely a good bedtime read. If you can't fall asleep, but it's all driven by this need for category management and agency performance. So I honestly, I would say, and I was at a different conference earlier this week and asked GSA the same question of, it is actually shrinking the small business pool. So why do you guys keep doing this? The answer is, yeah, they're required to. The category management mandate is requiring them to do this. All right. Well, there are other questions here. I'm sorry.
Oh no, there has been some talk on the Hill about doing something with that, but we're probably not going to see something for another couple of years, I guess.
Yeah, the trend needs to reverse now. The good news is that they are opening up to other set-asides, which is nice. At least more small business can get in to DHS. It's an important agency with a big budget. So I do hope that you all find this useful. Don't get discouraged. Continue to look and follow. There are a lot of industry notes being put out. We'll see. We are tracking it, and we'll probably do another webinar here to answer. Every time I can get a hold of Sai, I always tell people, when is the last time you got to talk free to a lawyer? So let's talk to Sai. I really appreciate your time, Sai. You're very generous with your time and helping us out here. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. And my shameless marketing team will not let me go without I put this slide up. We are offering a credit for people who'd like to use us for proposals. Reach out to us. You get no credit for calling Polaro Mazza. But if you come to us and say you want to file a protest, guess where I'm going to send you? I'm going to send you to Sai. So please continue to work with us, monitor this bid. Happy to answer any questions if you guys have it. Let me bring up the slide one more time with contact information. And Sai, thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.